Hello, my creative friends. Welcome to the Professional Artist's Watercolor Set. I'm so excited to show you this new set that I created. I have worked with watercolors professionally for over 25 years as an illustrator, so I sort of have a feel for how real watercolors work, and I did my best to try to make these digital watercolors reflect that. They will still have their own unique characteristics to Procreate, but I did the best I could, and I also put in a lot of my own personal favorite things that watercolor does. When you get your set, you will have 5 different types of watercolor brushes. So you have the wet watercolor, you have the dry watercolor, you have color shifting, where the colors shift in sort of a random way, and you have textures, which is part of the beauty of watercolor in my opinion. And then I gave you a little sketch and blend set. So with watercolor, generally I always sketch out my drawings with a pencil and leave some of that pencil in to show the handcraftedness of the watercolor. And then 2 blenders, a smoothie blender that smooths, blends colors together smoothly, and sort of a cloudy one that's got a little bit of texture in it. So in this video, we will just look at the different brushes and what they do so that you have an idea of how to handle them and the possibilities. But after this, I will be making more videos dealing with little projects and fun things that you can do with the watercolor set. So please subscribe to my channel and you will be notified of when those videos are available. All right, so let's check out the wet watercolors first. The first 3 brushes in here that have the word mixer after them, so the soft mixer, wet mixer, and wabi-sabi mixer. Those 3 brushes I designed to pretty much mix on their own without having to use a blender. And you can go ahead later and add a little bit of the blending tool, but I tried to remove that extra step of laying down color and then having to blend it. I've heard from other artists, including myself, that come from traditional media that we're kind of frustrated with Procreate watercolors brushes often because you have to do this 2-step process, whereas in real watercolor, you blend it as you go, So I used my experience with watercolor to try to get it so it blends pretty much on its own. Here's the soft mixer. Let's try that one first. And I recommend you try this as well. Like, pick 2 colors and then try blending them. So I'm going to pick 2 that I know Procreate will mix. Some Procreate colors actually mix kind of wonky. So I will later do a video on Procreate color and how to work with it. But I'm going to pick from my cool color palette, a magenta over here. And what I'm doing is, as I move forward, I'm lightening up the pressure a little bit so that the paint gets lighter and lighter. And now I'm going to pick my second color, like maybe a blue, and then I get lighter and lighter on the pressure as I move towards that. And you'll see that in the center, I'm starting to make a 3rd color. There's a color shift here, a gradation of color, so that the 3rd color is a purple. So that blended really nicely without having to use a blender next. So let's try the next one. The next one is the wet mixer. And I'll use the same colors. We'll just compare these all together. Okay, so the wet mixers kind of slides across the surface. Now I'm going to get lighter and lighter as I go on my stylus pressure. And then I'll get the magenta. I'm pressing down heavy, and then I'm lightening up the pressure on my stylus. Ooh, look at that. Not too bad. So that's going to allow you to create, one-step process with maybe a little bit of touch-up later if you want to. But I don't know. I don't like that two-step process if I don't have to. I like when watercolors actually flow. So that was my goal with these first three. And then Wabi Sabi Mixer, I threw that in because it's got this sense of randomness, and I think that's important, especially coming from traditional painting, where you have to let go of some of your control and allow for, as Bob Ross would say, happy accidents. So let's try that one. All right, so I'll start with the blue again, and let's make this a little larger. There we go. And this one, I kind of just scatter it around randomly, and then I'm going to lighten up the pressure a little and keep kind of jiggling it. And then let's get the magenta, and I'll do the same thing going the other way. Okay, a little heavier pressure. Now I'm getting lighter with my random brush strokes. And once again, here we go. Now what I like about this one is, like I said, it's got an uncontrolledness. It's got sort of a randomness. You have to kind of leave it up to serendipity and fate. Because here's like a big textural spot that happened. But I really like that. That's actually a lot what happens in real watercolor. See the back here where I've got real watercolor, and you can see right here how inconsistent real watercolor can be. Here, I'm going to push this over. It can be very inconsistent, which is its beauty. So here we go. There you've got it. You've got the first three wet watercolor brushes. Okay, so let's take a look at, I'll go a little faster. Here's Expressive Streak. Let's see, I'll pick maybe a purple color. And this one is just great for making some fun streaks, maybe stems for your plants, or maybe the tail feather of some kind of colorful bird, or maybe even mountains. This one is called Watery Strokes, and the Watery Strokes is pressure sensitive. If you have an Apple Pencil, it's going to work best. But the great thing about it is, as I push down and get lighter and heavier, I get all these kind of fun, inconsistent, beautiful strokes. So have fun playing around with that one. And let's see, let's go ahead and move up a little. And next I will use the feathered strokes. I don't know, this set is definitely designed by me because I love watercolor texture and I love the beauty of its randomness. So feathered strokes is another one that's just got this playful quality to it. Let's see, I'll pick a different color, maybe red. Here we go. And this is pressure sensitive, so as I lighten up, I get thinner and bigger. And this looks a lot like a watercolor bleed. So you could even use this to add on to some of your images if you want to give some expressive qualities, like the watercolors bleeding off into the paper. So I've added 2 new brushes to this set, and 2 of them are Wet Frayed Edges and Puddles and Blossoms. And these are just so cool, I had to add them. So, okay, let's take a look at the Wet Frayed Edges. All right. And I can kind of layer it a little bit and get some darker areas and so forth. But look at how it has this sort of really wet watercolory look. The edges are fraying and feathering. It looks like the watercolor is pooling more intense, with more intense color in some areas and then lightening up in other areas. Let's try mixing it with a different color. Oh yeah, let's try one more color. Let's see, let's try maybe, there we go. That'll do like a, and maybe one more color, just for fun. All right. So take a look at that. I love this because it's starting to look like really watery watercolor, the way it pools and has areas of more transparency and then more saturated color, bleeds and feathering. The colors are also mixing and intermingling. I just find this lovely, so I had to add this paintbrush to the set. Okay, and then the next brush that I recently added is called Puddles and Blossoms, and it's also very watery, but it does, just like it says, it kind of puddles and blossoms. So let's say I'll do I'll do another dark blue that just shows up really well. All right, so I'm swirling it around, and then I'm going to swirl a little bit more in the center, and look at that, looks a lot. I'll add just a little more to it. There we go. That looks a lot like watercolor that blossoms out. Whenever you use, like, usually with wet on wet, where you wet the paper and then you drop some wet watercolor in there, you'll see this blossoming happen where the watercolor is spreading out and getting thinner and thinner. So you have this intense area here, and then it spreads out, just like this real watercolor paper that I have down here. You can see there's a blossom. And a lot of times it'll be darker in the center and then blossom out and flow with the water. So that one's really fun to play with. You can make little spots like that. You can get creative with it. I mean, it doesn't have to be spots. It can be blobs and lines and so forth. But as you add a little bit in areas, and you can see how it looks like there's puddles and there's blossoms. So there you go, there's puddles and blossoms. And once again, you could also add these puddles and blossoms together and get some really cool intermingling where the water is kind of seeping in and blossoming. The virtual water. That's what's so cool about this, is it's like, you can't believe it's virtual. It really, this one actually really feels like water. Might try doing just a little white and see what happens. That's really cool. So have fun with this one. It has a lot of potential. So now let's take a look at some of the dry watercolors. You have a little folder here of dry watercolor, and like it says, they're a little bit more dry look to them, either dry edges or just totally dry paint, and then some kind of are on the borderline between dry and wet. I didn't know where to put them, so they ended up in here. So let's take a look. Here's dried edges, and we'll go ahead and take a look at dried edges. And you can see it's sort of like the edge is a lot darker than the center in a lot of areas. That happens as the watercolor comes up against the paper, and it's obviously dry paper, so it doesn't keep flowing out, and then it solidifies and gets dark there where the pigment hangs out. And then in the center, where there was some water, it gets lighter. The science of watercolor. It's actually really fascinating. So here's another color. I'm laying it over, and there's a little bit of transparency. And these do kind of blend. If I keep swirling it around, then I get just the dry edges on the outside of my shape. But if I don't, I'll get these sort of overlapping shapes that are happening. So it just depends on what you want to achieve with that one. And then we have dried edges number 2. Let's take a look at that one. And it's just a little bit more rough, or a lot more rough on the edges. And I guess you could say that's a bit of a bleed or feathering, but once again it has that dark edge where the pigment is hitting and can't go any further and dries out, and then the center gets kind of transparent. So just another one with dried edges to play with. This one's just a little bit rougher. Once again, you can keep swirling around and then you won't have any overlap, or you can keep going and you'll get this sort of inconsistent look. So you have to just decide what kind of effect you're looking for. Here's a lighter color. Let's try putting it over that. Ooh, that's cool. So it's up to you to explore these and experiment and see what kinds of cool effects you can get. All right, and then the next one is frayed edges. Let's try that one out. Let's see. Okay, so this one is just borderline as far as, I didn't know if it was wet or dry, but it has sort of that dried edge look, but it's really fuzzy and frayed. And I love when it overlaps. It does some interesting things. Let's get a really light color and overlap into the darker color, see what happens. That's really cool. Maybe if I jiggle it a little. All right. So, I don't know. That one's definitely probably somewhere between wet and dry. All right, so next I have a grunge brush, a gritty brush, a rough, and some other types of things that are very textural. So here's a grunge brush. Now the grunge brush, when I stamp it, I can see more of the grunge texture, and when I slide it, I get a little bit different effect. So I'll put an orange in here. Yeah, there we go. So it's got a different way of mixing than some of the other things. I'm going to put white here. You know, when I look at these, I think of more like backgrounds and landscapes and things like that. But once again, the sky's the limit. You look at these and think of the possibilities for your own kind of artwork that you like. So the other ones are also rough and have texture and so forth. The gritty, the rough glaze. The rough glaze is sort of transparent. Let's see, let's put a rough glaze over this. So maybe I'll do like let's see, how about a orange, deeper orange? Let's try it. It's really light and it takes some time for it to show because it's like using really thin, dry watercolor. As if that's possible. Only with digital can I get away with that. Because to thin out watercolor, you really need water. But that's the beauty, is I took a little bit of liberty with these. To give you some choices. There you go. So it ends up in the end looking like dried out paint, but it takes several layers for this one to build up. That might be good for, like, if you want to add a vintage effect or just a hint of color. Okay, and then we've got, oh, I didn't do the gritty brush. The gritty brush is pretty cool. It's just another really dry looking paint there. All right, so let's do the slippery sand. So I might as well pick a sand color, why not? And this one has this thing where it's almost like pigment, a little dried pigment of the watercolor, and the water is kind of coming out. And this actually is based on my own experience of rejuvenating watercolors that were really, really dry, and they would end up having this inconsistent pigment, or sometimes if I used rough paper it would do that. And I personally just loved that effect, so I thought that would be a fun one to try to put in there. And then other ones, chameleon brush. You know, I just gave that one that name because I couldn't tell if it was a dry or a wet brush. It's got this strange, wonderful quality to it. It slips around on the surface like it's wet, but there's moments where it starts to get these sort of dried looking textural edges. All right, and then the last one is opaque watercolor. And let's see here. Opaque watercolor is almost gouache, because really gouache is opaque watercolor. But believe it or not, I worked with a set by Pelican that was called Opaque Watercolor. And so I decided to give you an opportunity to have watercolor that's just a little bit more opaque than your regular watercolor. And if you want to think of it as gouache, that's fine. They're both watercolor, really. Gouache and watercolor. Watercolor is just more watery, and gouache is more opaque and a little bit more thick. So this one kind of goes between those boundaries. It defies labels. This one would be a good one to use to layer over your watercolor for little details. If you have extra stuff you want to add on top, it'll cover over it, so that's kind of nice. All right, so let's take a look at the color shifting brushes. These brushes shift color just slightly, sometimes a little dramatically, but generally more, only one or two colors over in the color wheel. Each time you stroke or you use a different pressure, each one's a little different. So let's take a look at those. Here's one called Slippery Color. Okay. All right, so I'm going to use a blue, and let's try this one. Okay, so I lay down a stroke, and then when I pick it up, another color comes up. Okay, so here's the Cosmic Whale, and I just love this one for doing a whale or an elephant or maybe a galaxy, because its texture is just so gorgeous. So let's see, maybe I'll do like a purpley, desaturated purple color. Now it does shift slightly. I made it so it shifts real slightly. There's a little bit of, it's probably hard to see, but there's a little bit of bluish coming in here, and then there's purple, and then there's some different tones of purple. Let's try that again. That didn't really show up very well with that color. Okay, let's see. I'll try like a deep blue. There we go. That shows it up much more dramatically. And that is, to me, that definitely has a lot of possibilities. And then this one's gritty color. And I'll go ahead and pick maybe an orange. And this one changes color as you're going. So there's like an orange in here, and there's like some yellow. And now I picked up my brush, so it's going to start to add other colors. All right, so use your imagination. This could be a garden of fanciful bushes. It could be a galaxy again. It could be a texture on a colorful bird. I'm just throwing ideas out there, but I hope that as you look through these, you allow your own imagination to take hold and just go with it. These are meant to kind of not just paint what you have in your mind, but to inspire you with new ideas. So here is the fluffy cloud brush, and this one is perfect for a sky. But I can imagine there might be lots of uses for it. So let's take a look. So every time I pick up my brush with this one, it shifts the color. Let's get a different color. Maybe I'll do one of the more warm blues in here. And I could even go to white, like clouds, and try to make some clouds. Now, I believe it also tries to shift the white slightly, so sometimes you'll get bright white and sometimes you'll get a more grayish white, just like clouds. And then this is the color pressure brush, and just like it says, it reacts to the pressure that you use with your stylus. I thought that this one might be good for doing leaves and maybe some earth. Let's see, I'm going to go to earthy greens. So I'm letting up light and I get more of a yellow green here, and then there I've got a darker green. So heavy, light, heavy, light. It takes a really delicate touch between going heavy to really super light to heavy to super light. So always practice these and get a feel for them so that you're not frustrated when you're working. You've had a little practice of how much pressure to get the effect that you want. And now for my favorite brushes, the texture brushes. Let me show you some real watercolor texture, and then we'll get into the brushes. So underneath my iPad, I placed a couple sheets of real watercolor that I did earlier. And you can see all the varieties of texture. Well, this is only a small portion of the textures that you can get with real watercolor. And it's what's unique about watercolor that gives it its beauty. I mean, there's things where there's these blooms where the watercolor blooms and blossoms in the water. There's these hard and rough edges that are created where the watercolor kind of stops and starts to dry out and gets these hard, dark edges. And And then there's places right here where you get this sort of rough texture where the watercolor is pooling inside the valleys of the rough textured paper, and it gives this sort of rough, inconsistent looking color, which is just so beautiful. Oh, look at this edge right here, and places where watercolor bleeds into the other watercolor. And there's so many things you can do with texture with watercolor. Here's little splashes, you can add salt, you can even do things like put saran wrap and cheesecloth on top of watercolor, let it dry and pull it off and get interesting textures. So that is one of the unique and beautiful things about watercolor that I personally really love. So let's take a look at the texture brushes. Okay, so here I've gone ahead and created sort of a cloud pattern with my cloud brush, and I'll go into the watercolor textures, and the first one you'll see is Salt Crystals Stamp. So we're going to stamp on some salt crystals, and I will get a white color, but you can actually use all kinds of colors, but I'm going to use white. Let's see, I've got another layer. I'll stamp it on top. Those are some little table salt crystals. Those are very small. Let's make some big rock crystals there. So you can do different sizes and just add interesting texture to your watercolor that you've done. The next two brushes are called sea sponges, and that's where you take a sponge and you dip it into watercolor and sponge it on to your watercolor paper and create really cool textures. So I gave you two sponges, one with a lot of texture and one with more refined. All right, so let's try out sea sponge number 1. If I kind of brush it, I can get some bigger patterns going on. And if I stamp it, I get sort of a consistent size that I set it to. So I'm going to call this one a stamp brush. You can use it as a stamp and a brush, and you'll get sort of different effects happening. All right, so look at that. Pretty intense. And sea sponge number 2 has a little bit more refined texture. And once again, you can brush this one or stamp it, and you'll get different kinds of effects. And then there's the spatter stamp. Sort of like you took a toothbrush and dipped it into watercolor paint and then flicked it onto the canvas, which is exactly what I did to create this stamp. So to give it a little bit of realism there. The next one is paint spots. And this one you can, once again, either stamp or brush it, and you'll get sort of different things happening. The next one is called Drippy, and this one you'll just stamp. Let's try it really large. Woo! And you can do it different sizes. And then later, if you want to, you can rotate them and position them in your painting the way that you like them. And the last one is called Splash. And it's a stamp. Splash! All right, there you go. So that should give you a lot of variety to work with to add extra texture and some pizzazz to your watercolor. So last but not least is a set for sketching and also blending. So you have a sketch pencil, a technical pen, a soft airbrush, and then two types of blenders. One that's smooth for creating smooth gradations of color like I did here for the cherry, and one that's called cloudy that creates a little bit more, I don't know, a little bit more, I wouldn't say rough, but try it out and you'll see sort of a cloudy blending instead of so smooth. I think they're both beautiful. And lastly, I will end with a painting I did with my brush set that I've given you. And you can see here my mason jar and my plants. And oh, there's two butterflies in here, and that is actually in my iris flower set. So as you collect my sets, you'll have more variety to add to your stuff. So if you like this video, please subscribe, because I intend to create more showing examples of how you can use my watercolor brushes and fun little projects for you to do. Thank you for joining me, and keep on being creative. Congratulations for learning how to use my Procreate brush sets. And hit subscribe to learn about new and upcoming brush sets and fun tutorials for Procreate and Adobe Fresco.